Good morning, Oxygen Life Church. It is Friday morning, the first official morning of the lockdown, although I think a couple of us feel like we've been on lockdown for a while already, but it's real now, and it's 21 days, and God is with us, and this is our morning devotions, our daily devotions. I'm aware that for many, there will have been different levels and stages of fighting fear over this time. I think at the moment, along with that now, we move into a real battle for purpose and to feel like we are doing something for the Lord, as well as just enjoying Him, being with Him, dwelling in Him and remaining in Him. We want to feel like we're doing something for God, and we were made to live with purpose. And I think it's going to be a battle for us to find that perspective on what it means to live with purpose in the Lord during this time. And I think of Paul in Acts chapter 13 verse 36. He says, when David fulfilled God's purposes in his generation. And so God made us to live like that. And so now we find ourselves without many of the mechanisms that we've been able to find purpose in, like being together, for many people working, physically going to a place of work, doing something with your hands. And so we find ourselves having to ask ourselves, what is it to live with purpose? But the reality is the people of God have always lived with purpose in every circumstance. The people of God have found ways to be productive in the Lord in every circumstance. And there were many great people before us who've been limited. You think of John on the island of Patmos, when he gets the revelation from the Lord that becomes this letter to the churches. I think of Paul in the many situations where he was limited in his movements, he was limited in his freedoms, he was curtailed in his ability to travel about freely to the churches. And one of those would have certainly been when he was placed in jail regularly. And he was placed in jail at certain times, managed to get out, was freed, and then ultimately he ended up in jail and didn't leave and was actually martyred there. But when he was in jail, Paul did what he could do. I can imagine that Paul would have dwelt a lot on things that he couldn't do, and it would have been deeply frustrating for him. But what we see is that he did what he could do. And so one of the things he did was he wrote letters. And so part of the reason we have these amazing letters to the churches, you think of Philippians, you think of Colossians, you think of these wonderful letters of encouragement and strengthening to the churches, was that he was in a jail. And it was, he had a lot of time to sit and think. He had a lot of time to map out in his mind how he wanted to encourage people, what he wanted to say, what was important for them to hear. And so he writes these letters. I want to read in Romans 1, chapter 1 and verse 11. And he says this to the church in Rome. And you think about this amazing ancient document we've got, one of the longest written accounts we've got from the ancient world, this letter to the Romans. And he says this in 1 verse 11. He says, I long to see you so that I may impart to you some spiritual gift to make you strong. That is, that you and I may be mutually encouraged by each other's faith. And you realize he'd never met them. He'd never been physically in the same room as them. And you've got this whole letter, one of the most astounding expositions on justification by faith and what it means to be justified in the Lord, and such an encouragement. And he's mentioning people, and you've got Romans 16, this long list of people who he's so fond of, he loves so much. And he'd never met the people that he was writing to, this church in Rome. He'd never actually been with them. And he was able to use this. At the time, it was the most sophisticated manner of being able to communicate when you weren't there in person, these letters that they would write and send. Today we've got abilities to write to each other, to send each other voice notes, to send each other WhatsApps. I believe the Lord is going to fill us with purpose as we make use of those mechanisms to build each other up, to strengthen each other, to remind each other of the Lord, to remind each other of this great gospel and what the Lord has done in us, to speak life over each other. And the other thing I see that Paul did, certainly I think far more than he wrote, was that he prayed. Paul prayed for the Romans. From that same little section in Romans chapter 1, I want to read what he says in verse 9 and 10. He says, God, whom I serve with my whole heart in preaching the gospel of his Son, is my witness how constantly I remember you in my prayers at all times. And I pray that now, at last, by God's will, the way may be opened for me to come to you. And he says, in my prayers, I remember you at all times. And the first thing to take note of there is that he says, my prayers. In other words, for him, there was a daily rhythm of prayers. And there was times he was just bringing himself before the Lord. I think he would have been reveling in just the Lord's grace to him. He would have been thanking God. And then he had times where he would bring those he either knew face to face or he knew of, and he would bring them to the Lord in prayer. And he said to them, I remember you at all times. In other words, he was constantly praying. And it was Paul who said to the Thessalonians, he said, pray continually, pray continually. And so Paul had purpose, even in his time of being isolated from people, even in his time where he maybe had one or two people who were permitted to come and maybe write down his letters or maybe take them for him. He had very, very limited freedoms from the incredible productivity he had when he was able to travel freely and able to go and be with churches and say to Barnabas, let's go and visit these churches that we planted, let's go see how they're doing. He was able to do that, and he went from that, he would kind of alternate between that and total limitation of what he was able to do. But he prayed and he prayed and he prayed. I used to spend time in old age homes when a few years ago. I regret that I haven't been doing it recently, but I would really like to start again. But I spent time in old age homes, and the people that I found who had the most joy and the most faith and the most purpose were those who prayed, because they realized they had time to pray. And I found the people who actually struggled with being old the most and struggled with being in a frail care center was those who didn't want to call on the Lord and didn't want to serve God. But and there were many old ladies who realized, I can pray now. And they would pray and pray. And I want to tell you, we used to come into the presence. I remember one old lady, she was so bent over by, it must have been osteoporosis or something, but her back was bent. And I remember I used to walk up to her bed and I could feel like I'm in the presence of greatness. I don't say that in a strange way. Just genuinely, I'm in the presence of someone who is communing with God. And this woman would pray and pray and pray every day. And I think there's something there for us to live in purpose, to use our words to build each other up, to strengthen each other, to use our words to the Lord, to do what none of us can do in this time physically. I'm carrying the poor in my heart so much in our city. I'm thinking of the people in our townships, and I don't know what to do. I don't know how to help them. The reality is I can't. I'm not allowed to by law go and be with them. But we can pray. We can pray. We can pray for each other in our communities, our family. We can pray for each other. And we can pray for those in our city who are vulnerable and needy. I think it's just about the only thing we can do right now. May God fill us with purpose. With purpose. Not only to survive, not only to feel like, well, we're okay, but purpose to advance His kingdom. And we're going to do that by words of encouragement to each other and by prayer. May God bless you.